You think you're standing still, but in truth you're spinning in circles within the same frame. It's not the world that repeats. It's your gaze that doesn't penetrate. What you see is only the visible part of what you believe to be real. But here's something almost no one notices. Reality doesn't present itself as it is. It reveals itself as you sustain it. When you insist on seeing everything from the same angle, even the invisible starts to hide. There is a door, but it doesn't open with effort. It dissolves the moment the observer dissolves too. Silence, not the outer world, but that noise running inside as if it's explaining everything to you. Nothing needs to be understood right now. There is something older than your words, more precise than your judgments. Breathe as if you weren't searching for anything, as if this moment carried a secret that only reveals itself to those who don't demand it. Because maybe what you call reality is only the reflection of a gaze that forgot how to see. You've already tried to change reality with force, with plans, with promises made at midnight, but something inside always seemed to return to the same point, like a river that, no matter where it spreads, finds the same dark bed to run through. You change places, switch paths, reinvent desires, but there is a repetition that follows like an invisible shadow, not in what happens, but in the way you perceive what happens. It's like living inside an old stained glass window. Every piece of your story colors the world with a specific filter, and no matter how the sun shifts, the light that enters is still the one you learn to tolerate. Some spend their whole lives cleaning the windows, trying to see further, but the image that returns is always a variation of the same internal reflection, because what's trapped isn't outside. It's at the exact point where your gaze got used to not seeing, and it's in that place that the doors of reality remain closed, not out of punishment, but by vibration. Nothing opens while the observer is conditioned to predict what it sees. Maybe you've become a specialist in interpreting signs, but what happens when the sign is no longer external? What if it's your own vibrational field signaling the same path, the same scenario, the same density? Now silence. Close your eyes. Not to escape, but to dissolve the need to understand. There's a difference between seeing with open eyes and observing with a present body, because there is a listening that doesn't come from the ears. It pulses in the in-between lines of your own presence. Imagine a garden that only blooms when no one is watching, not out of fear, but from a demand for total presence. No expectations, no surveillance, just being. That's the kind of reality that can't be forced. It blooms the moment internal vigilance falls asleep, when the observer sheds its interpretations. Have you ever wondered how many versions of yourself are still watching you from within? Old selves that still carry the glasses of childhood, the filters of pain, the reflections of who you once had to be, each one watching the world as if it were still yesterday, as if the danger was still there, as if life was still something to defend against. But this now is no longer that time. The reality that presents itself today no longer responds to what you fear. It resonates with what you choose to observe, not with conscious desire, but with the silent focus that sustains your field. That's why changing the way you see is not a mental effort. It's a stripping down of presence, a surrender that expects no guarantee. And sometimes it starts with the simple act of breathing without seeking anything. The moment the gaze lets go of control is the same moment reality begins to change its texture, not as a visual miracle, but as a vibration that was previously hidden under excess interpretation. You feel the world soften, but can't say why. You sense time slow down, but the clock remains the same. It's because you stepped off the script, and reality for a moment no longer knew how to hold you. So it wavered, and in that wavering, something new began to form. Don't look to understand. Observe with the silence of someone who no longer needs the same answer. There is a moment when everything seems to slow down, but it's not peace, it's suspension, as if the world were waiting for something from you that you can't even name. You keep living, fulfilling, deciding, but there's a layer behind each action that seems untouched. A silent backdrop that watches even your most conscious movements with a kind of patience that unsettles. Sometimes this feeling shows up right after an achievement, other times in the middle of chaos, but the sensation is the same, a presence that doesn't fit what's happening, a frequency that can't be explained, but also doesn't go away. And the more you try to fill that space with certainty, the more it expands. It's like walking through an old house. You know every room, where the windows are, the furniture, the noises. But one day, by chance or exhaustion, you lean against a wall and hear a strange echo, a vibration that doesn't match the map of the house. And there you realize there's a room that has never been seen, an entire space hidden beneath the familiar architecture. That house is you, and that wall that sounds different is the edge between what's been conditioned and what still pulses unexplored. But few dare to cross, because crossing isn't running off in search of something new. It's the opposite. It's stopping long enough to hear the vibration of what hasn't yet been interpreted. Breathe here, not to calm down, but to perceive what still vibrates behind what you believe to be you. Maybe that door was never locked. Maybe it simply doesn't open to those who arrive intending to control it. And here comes the unsettling twist. What if everything you've been trying to change on the outside is still a reflection of what you refuse to see within? What if the discomfort you feel isn't life's mistake, but an invitation? It's not easy to accept that we are the very molds of the reality that limits us, because that demands something many avoid, changing the way we observe. But changing the observation is not a rational act. It's not done with effort, it's done with surrender, with the silent decision to stop interpreting everything through the lens of old pain, with the vibrational choice to allow a new lens to emerge, not as an answer, but as a consequence of listening. Think of the gaze of a child before something never seen. There is no judgment, no defense, there is awe and presence, a trust that doesn't demand explanation. Now notice, how many times in your day do you truly look like that? Or are you just reacting, analyzing, defending, protecting? The new reality doesn't ask you to become someone else, but to suspend for a moment the character that always knew what was going on. Because in that moment, something truer might come through. And maybe that passage won't come with clear signs. Maybe it will come with longer silences, with desires that have no reason, with a longing that has no name. Maybe it's in that space between what you control and what you feel that the door starts to vibrate differently. But the question is, can you stay there without rushing the next step? Or are you still searching with the same gaze for a reality that no longer speaks the language of your old certainties? You want to change your life, but you still see the world with the eyes you learned to use in trauma. You want freedom, but measure each step with the ruler of control. You want peace, but distrust everything that doesn't come with immediate proof. The paradox settles in without you noticing. You wish for a new reality, but the frequency of your gaze still carries traces of the old prison. It's like trying to fly with the body's wings and blaming the sky for not making room. There is a deep addiction to interpreting everything from the wound, even what is neutral, even what comes as a possibility. The old mind is always ready to label, predict, anticipate pain. And the strangest thing is that you've gotten used to this mechanism, not because it does you good, but because it makes you feel familiarity, and what is familiar seems safer than the unknown, even when it hurts. You say you want to cross over, but you carry with you all the maps you drew while you were lost. You cry out for a new version of yourself, but you recite the same phrases you once learned to protect yourself. And the most subtle part, you still observe everything as if the world were a constant threat, a continuous vigilance, a survival filter that is no longer necessary, but still pulses as if it were vital. Now breathe, but not as relief. Breathe like someone who recognizes they are still holding up the same script, even without wanting to. Because this is the point few dare to look at. The new reality is not waiting for you on the other side of the wall. It is already here, but vibrating on another layer. A layer that only becomes accessible when you dismantle piece by piece the armor of old interpretation. And it hurts. Not because it's wrong, but because you've confused yourself with the armor. You think that without it you won't know who you are, that without the old meanings the world will be too chaotic, that without the control of your gaze you'll be swallowed by your own surrender. But what if all of this is just another layer of illusion, another trick of the old self trying to survive in the absence of conflict? What if suffering is no longer necessary, but is still being fed by the way you name what you feel? Now stop. Don't try to understand. Just observe what's active inside you at this very moment. Maybe it's just tightness in your chest, a slight tension in your shoulders, a memory that passed like wind. That's the door. But it doesn't look like a passage. It looks like discomfort, like the unease of no longer being able to lean on the same certainties, like the emptiness that arises when the old no longer fits. and the new hasn't yet formed. Don't try to fill this with answers, or with practices, or with pretty phrases. Stay in this interval where everything seems disorganized, where your mind has no reference, where your emotions seem to come from a place you don't control. This is where the field is reconfigured, but only if you don't interrupt it with explanations, because the new reality doesn't begin with a decision. It begins with a gaze that, finally, has shed the layers that were never its own. You observe the world trying to find signs. You wait for silent confirmations that you're on the right path, that something will finally make sense. You look at situations as if consulting an external oracle, asking for clues, asking for direction, asking for a truce. But there's a subtle detail that changes everything. While you observe seeking answers, you don't notice the field vibrating questions. You learn to decipher, to analyze, to predict, and with that, you became almost blind to the feeling that doesn't follow logic. There are days when everything seems fine, but your body tightens. There are moments when your gaze smiles, but something inside feels heavy, as if it were out of time. This contrast is not a mistake. It's the gap, a cut between what you sustain mentally and what is being revealed vibrationally. It's in this silent friction that the new observation begins to arise, not as a concept, but as a pulse. The mind wants certainties, the body wants relief, but the field only wants presence, not the performed presence, self-aware, but the one that happens when you stop narrating the moment. Now close your eyes, on the inside. Breathe, as if something old were about to let go, but didn't know how. What if the new reality isn't a conquest? What if it's a memory that only reappears when you stop trying to deserve it? The small revelation that comes here is not an answer. It's a deviation, a whisper that doesn't fit the logic of what you expected to find. Like a sacred noise coming from a place you've never inhabited. Maybe the door was never an entrance. Maybe it's a collapse point between what you insist on seeing and what is already vibrating beyond sight. And when you start to allow observation to no longer serve expectation, something shifts. The world doesn't change, but the way it touches you does. You begin to perceive what was always there. Not the facts, but the frequencies. Not the events, but the echoes. Life stops being just a sequence of happenings and becomes a responsive field. It's as if reality starts to listen to you, not to what you say, but to what you emit without realizing. This listening of the field only activates when you stop trying to be understood and start feeling what is being mirrored. At that point, old reactions lose strength, judgments dissolve before forming into sentences, and a clarity arises that doesn't think, it just vibrates. You still feel fear, but it's not the same anymore. It doesn't paralyze. It just passes, like wind through the trees of an inner forest you had never crossed. Now, observe what is different, without naming, without translating. The feeling you have now may not match what's around you, and that is a sign. The visible reality is delayed in relation to what you've already begun to emit. Don't try to rush it, or hold it back. Stay here, where time unravels, where logic loses its shape, where presence begins to become language. The new reality doesn't need to be understood to be lived. It's enough that your gaze stops competing with what you feel, and that silence opens the next door. There is a moment when everything seems to become unfamiliar. The breathing changes rhythm, the thoughts stop being in a hurry, the memories no longer scream like before, and the body, even without knowing how to explain, allows itself to exist without defense. It's as if something that was scattered slowly begins to come together, without effort, without direction. Imagine an old tapestry, forgotten in time, each thread interwoven with stories you didn't even remember you had lived. Faded colors of versions of yourself that no longer make sense, yet still compose the background of the image. And suddenly, a new thread begins to be embroidered. It doesn't cover the old, it doesn't erase, but reveals another way of belonging, a truer fit between what you are and what vibrates around you. This is the new observation, not to see differently, but to be different when seeing. You don't need to understand how this happens, you just need not to interfere. The old mind will try to name, to create theory, to fit everything into what it already knows. But that's not how the new reality reveals itself. It doesn't speak the language of repetition. It murmurs in silences where there used to be only noise. Observe without seeking. That is already transformation. Notice how your skin feels the environment now, how your eyes rest on things without demanding meaning, how your thoughts lose their rigidity when you don't feed them with urgency. Something is realigning inside, but the axis is not in control. It's in listening. You are like a seed that always carried within it the blueprint of the tree, but spent years trying to decipher the soil. And when you finally give up analyzing the terrain, the roots begin to form, slowly, silently, deeply. Nothing more needs to be added. The field is already whole. What changes is your ability to be present in it without the old filter. This is the integration that doesn't demand achievement. It happens when you stop dividing yourself into parts. When pain is no longer an enemy to be conquered, but a mark on your internal map that can now be touched without fear. When desire is no longer a cry for something external, but a vibration that aligns with what you already contain. This state has no name, no technique. It has pulse, a rhythm that reveals itself when you stop dancing according to the script of scarcity. And then you feel space expand, but not outside, inside. The breath goes deeper. Time seems to stop judging your steps, and even silence ceases to be absence and becomes language. Stay there, where there is nothing left to prove, where the moment is enough, because in that place, everything meets, even without being sought. And what once seemed a fragment now dances as unity. There is a part of you that already knows, always knew, but it was silenced, pushed to the corners of consciousness, like an inconvenient whisper in a world that demands loud certainties. This part doesn't argue, it observes, and it observes from a place that doesn't seek meaning, but presence. But there is another part, the one that learned to survive by explaining everything. That turns intuition into logic, sensation into control, moment into destiny. This part fears the invisible, because in the invisible, it doesn't command. And so every time the new approaches, it's this old mind that rises, cataloging, protecting, rationalizing. And here the paradox is born. You want transformation, but fear letting go of the references that keep you whole. You want to see differently, but insist on looking with yesterday's eyes. It's like trying to open a new window in the same wall you once swore never to tear down. The rupture happens when the gaze no longer obeys what it was trained to confirm. And for a second, a single second, something inside does not react as it always did. There's a space between impulse and action, a crack between thought and response. And that is where everything starts to reorganize, not with euphoria, with strangeness. Because when the new arrives, it doesn't soothe, it deconstructs. It's like walking on ground that dissolves with each step, and still continuing to walk, not knowing if there is anything ahead, or if you are the one creating the next ground simply by observing without turning back. Now pause. Breathe as someone who doesn't want to rush the truth. There's no longer a need to struggle to see. Just don't interfere. When the gaze stops asking for signs, the world stops performing to convince you, and everything returns to being what it is, without the distortion of expectation. In this state, you don't control the field. You listen. You don't ask for direction. You feel where not to go. It's in this lightness that the density dissolves. The weight of being who you thought you needed to be begins to fall, and what remains is not a new character, but a strange absence of mask. You find yourself bare of interpretations, simple, almost nothing, but intensely alive. And for a moment, reality no longer responds to your old identity. It hesitates, it opens as if it were asking, is that really you there? The portal is not a bright light. It's a pause in the repetition. It's the point where the habit of seeing is lost, and a possibility that wasn't in the script is born. At that point, nothing guarantees it will be comfortable, but something in you recognizes that it's true. And if you don't run, you might hear the sound of the world changing tone. But what if it's not the world? What if it's you who finally stopped looking from the same place? You don't cross into a new reality like someone crossing a line. You dissolve the old ground with the simple act of looking without the lenses of repetition. The world doesn't need to change first. It's your field that realigns matter when the gaze stops carrying the memory of fear. The door doesn't open with effort. It opens with presence, with the silent choice not to react as you always have, with the recognition that there's nothing left to defend when everything has already been embraced. Now the invisible becomes tangible, not because it changed form, but because you changed frequency. And what once seemed impossible becomes merely the natural reflection of your new state of being. You didn't come here to repeat stories. You came to remember that reality responds to the awakened observer. If this touched your vibration, right. I observe differently now. Because in the moment the gaze changes, everything begins to breathe differently too.